The White House officially announced today that any negotiations between the United States and Russia on normalizing relations and removing irritants have been completely stopped and frozen for an indefinite period. The United States also said restoring normal embassy operations in Moscow and Washington isn't even being discussed. Such a statement is extremely important against the backdrop of loud threats from Russians about testing nuclear weapons, the launch of the Burevestnik missile, and against the backdrop of United States sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil companies. Moreover, Washington expanded its sanctions against Russia today. The White House confirmed that the time for talks is over, as Russia behaved extremely absurdly during the latest negotiations. Well, if you think the Russians have finally sobered up, they haven't. Today, following such a statement from Washington, the Kremlin urgently brought out the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergei Lavrov, who stated that Russia is ready to resume talks about a meeting between Trump and Putin. But the demands remain the same: demilitarization and the so-called denazification of Ukraine. Lavrov also stated that if anyone in the world tests nuclear weapons, Russia will do the same. He says he doesn't intend to. But it seems that Lavrov is still not telling the whole truth. Because today, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, stated that Russia's war against Ukraine definitely will not escalate into a world war, even though such a threat was real at the beginning of this year. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and be sure to write any detailed comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription through the links and details provided. In the description of this video, it says there, support the channel Alexei Pichi. Choose any format that's convenient for you, any kind of support you prefer. So, today, American diplomats stated that the dialogue between the United States of America and Russia on removing irritants in their bilateral relations has completely stopped. Let me remind you, that's exactly how Russia tried to present any negotiations with Russians, as if these were talks about normalizing relations between the two countries. At the moment, a new round of negotiations, even about restoring the full operation of the embassies in Moscow and Washington, is not planned. The second and most recent round of consultations on irritants between the United States and Russia was held in Istanbul over 6 months ago, on April 10. After that, a third meeting in this particular format was never scheduled. In June, the ambassador of the Russian Federation to Washington, Alexander Darchiev, assured that it would take place very soon. But you know, they're Russians. Lying comes easy to them. They just can't do without it. As a result, the Russian Foreign Ministry later reported that the consultations were cancelled at the initiative of the American side. Then the talks were planned for late October to early November, but the sides still haven't agreed on them. Well, as you know, the meeting between Putin and Trump was cancelled altogether. And here the Russians are lying again, because today, well, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, noted that the dialogue with the American side is ongoing, but, quote, not as quickly as they would like. At the same time, he couldn't say when or where a new meeting to discuss these irritants in bilateral relations might take place. Lavrov says the dialogue continues, but not as quickly as they'd like. And the Americans say that we don't communicate with the Russians at all, but Lavrov still has some negotiations going on. I should note here that consultations on resuming the full operation of embassies, returning Russian diplomatic property in the United States, restoring air travel between the countries, and overall normalization of relations were conducted in parallel with the negotiations on ending Russia's war against Ukraine, which ultimately achieved nothing. The Russians tried to outsmart everyone, primarily Donald Trump's administration, and establish new trade and economic ties with the United States, bypassing Ukraine. Russia's war on Ukraine is one issue. Restoring Moscow-Washington relations is entirely separate. And those who have been subscribed to my YouTube channel for a long time remember that I have long said the main danger was that the Russians could convince the Trump administration that, listen, Russia's war against Ukraine is of course a problem, but let's build business, trade, and economic relations without paying attention to this war. And the danger was that If Trump built his relations with the Russians according to this logic, then at some point relations with the Russians would start to prevail over the issue of Russia's war against Ukraine. And then the Trump administration could say, listen, do we really need to quarrel with the Russians because of Ukraine? And supposedly the Russians assured that nothing prevents normalizing relations between the United States and Russia while continuing the war against Ukraine. After the second meeting, the Americans made it clear that relations won't normalize as long as Russia continues the war against Ukraine. That these are not parallel issues after all, but actually directly related questions. And the Russians themselves are now nervously stating that 99% of the Russian-American dialogue was centered around Ukraine. And for clarity, I want to point out that there isn't even an American ambassador in Moscow at the moment. That's why all talks were held directly with the White House. That's exactly why Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's envoy, suddenly rushed and flew to Washington when Trump imposed sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil in October, because there are simply no other channels of communication. Let me remind you that in late October, United States President Donald Trump drastically changed his stance on Russia. He cancelled the planned meeting in Budapest with the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and imposed sanctions against the country's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. According to Reuters sources, Trump's decision was influenced by the Kremlin's maximalist demands, which it is putting forward to end the war against Ukraine. At the same time, these demands were conveyed to the American side by Lavrov during a conversation with the head of the United States State Department, Marco Rubio. And after the collapse of the Trump-Putin summit, Lavrov fell out of favor in the Kremlin and did not appear at the landmark meeting of the Russian Security Council in early November, where Putin threatened nuclear tests. In addition, Lavrov lost his status as the head of the Russian delegation at the G20 summit in Johannesburg. And this year, it will be headed by the deputy head of the Russian presidential administration, Maxim Oreshkin. And what are the Russians doing in this situation? The Russians decided to join the negotiations. On the other hand, the Kremlin hopes that negotiations on security and nuclear weapons will resume soon. That is, Russia is now deliberately escalating the nuclear issue to force Donald Trump into a dialogue with Vladimir Putin. Otherwise, the Americans don't even want to talk to the Russians, no matter how much Dmitriev tries to fly to Washington and somehow persuade the Americans to resume dialogue. Trump's team all knew talking to Putin was pointless. On the contrary, today Trump, for example, is putting serious pressure on Turkey and is demanding that Recep Tayyip Erdogan refuse Russian energy resources. And it seems that Trump has really adopted this strategy of completely eliminating any petrodollars from Russia's budget. Trump said today that Russia's war on Ukraine won't become a world war, though that was a real threat earlier this year. Well, let me quote him further. If I were president, this war would never have happened. And if I hadn't been president, this war could have led to World War III. This won't happen again. And now, some experts are saying that after such a statement, Trump might go all out, as they say, and start putting even more pressure on Putin's regime, because now he doesn't see the risk of the war expanding. In this regard, today the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, unexpectedly appeared in public and addressed the United States of America with a request to resume preparations for the summit between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Budapest, which was supposed to take place at the end of October but was cancelled after the Kremlin refused to cease fire in Ukraine. As Lavrov said today, Moscow is ready to discuss resuming summit preparations with their American colleagues. Budapest remains the preferred location for the meeting, if and when the American colleagues renew their proposal. So, in other words, Moscow is once again asking for negotiations in order to try to deceive Trump again, but it's telling that even the head of the United States State Department, Marco Rubio, hasn't spoken with Lavrov since their last conversation on October 20. Lavrov admitted this today with resentment, saying, "I don't understand why. We talked on October 20 and haven't spoken since." The Russian Foreign Ministry had discussed summit preparations in Budapest with Rubio by phone. Afterward, Rubio advised Trump to cancel the meeting. For the first time since Trump entered the White House, the United States imposed major sanctions on Russia. And now just listen to this lament of Yaroslavna. Next, I will quote Sergei Lavrov. "We still don't understand why the United States canceled that summit. We had a good, polite conversation with Marco Rubio, without any disruptions, confirmed in principle the progress based on the Anchorage understanding, and then parted ways. The next step was to have a meeting of representatives from foreign policy, military, and likely intelligence agencies, as I understand it. But instead, there was a public statement saying that there was no point in meeting. That's how it is. Lavrov doesn't understand. He doesn't get what happened. Well, he just doesn't understand. But it's true. Later, this same Lavrov stated that before the conversation between Lavrov and Rubio, Russia sent a memorandum on Ukraine to the United States, which supposedly contained nothing except what was discussed in Anchorage. And here's another quote from Lavrov. The purpose of this memorandum was to remind our American colleagues about what was discussed in Anchorage and what understandings were reached there. And then Lavrov stated that he demanded demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine from the Americans. But he immediately added that Putin's media lied when they said that these maximalist demands from the Kremlin were the reason for the cancellation of the Trump-Putin summit. He still says he doesn't get it. We had a normal conversation, so why didn't Putin and Trump meet in Budapest? Here we are demanding Ukraine's capitulation, some mythical denazification, just spouting complete nonsense 24/7. But still, Lavrov doesn't understand what's going on. So, now we'll be watching as Russians will be asking, I emphasize asking the Americans for a meeting, for dialogue, both through Lavrov's words and with threats of nuclear tests, and they'll be getting louder and louder. But the Kremlin has shown that they're very scared when the Americans stay silent and squeeze them with sanctions. So I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye all.